Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook vault. The person who controls the group is almost never the person the group thinks is controlling it. In every small group you have ever been part of, whether a circle of close friends, a team of colleagues, a family unit, or any other aggregation of people small enough to have faces and histories attached to every member, there was someone whose influence over the group's decisions, its mood, its direction, and its collective sense of what was possible exceeded what their formal role or their visible behavior would seem to justify. You may have sensed this person without being able to fully articulate what made them different from the others. You may have noticed that the group's energy shifted when they spoke, that their apparent preferences became the group's preferences without any visible mechanism of persuasion, that decisions which should have been contested seemed to resolve in directions that consistently served their interests without anyone in the group being aware that a consistent pattern was operating. What you were observing was not charisma in the conventional sense and not formal authority in any organizational sense. You were observing the operation of a precise and largely invisible set of social influence mechanisms that operate most powerfully in exactly the size of group where most people's actual lives are determined, the small group of 3 to 15 people whose collective decisions shape your daily reality more completely than any large institution ever will. The large crowd is the subject of most influence literature, the psychology of masses, the mechanics of propaganda, the dynamics of public opinion. These are the domains that have received the most academic attention and produced the most widely read popular frameworks, and they are almost entirely irrelevant to the social reality in which most people's lives are actually determined. Your salary negotiation does not happen in a crowd. Your promotion is not decided by a mass. Your social standing, your access to opportunities, your experience of daily belonging or exclusion, these are determined by the small groups you inhabit, by the 5 people you spend the most time with, by the 8 colleagues who form the actual social fabric of your workplace, by the 12 members of the social circle whose collective assessment of you shapes every social opportunity you receive or are denied. These small groups are where your life happens, and the person who understands how they work from the inside, who can read their invisible hierarchies and navigate their informal power structures and influence their collective decision-making without triggering the resistance that visible leadership attempts generate, is the person whose life is shaped by their own choices rather than by the collective defaults of the groups they inhabit. In every day you pass without understanding these mechanisms, someone in your immediate social environment who does understand them is using that knowledge. Understanding to shape the group's decisions in directions that serve their interests, not necessarily against your interests, not necessarily with malicious intent, but with a precision and an effectiveness that your own unstructured participation in the group cannot match. The opportunities that did not come to you, the decisions that went in directions you did not prefer, the social dynamics that seemed to resolve consistently in ways that left you reactive rather than generative, these are not the products of bad luck or of other people's superior merit. They are frequently the products of influence, operating at a level of social reality that you were not yet equipped to see, and therefore not equipped to engage with on equal terms. This content is not for people who want to be more popular or more liked within their social circles. Popularity is a byproduct of conformity, optimized for the approval of the group's current preferences, and the person who is most popular within a group is frequently the person with the least independent influence over its direction. This is for people who have decided to understand how small groups actually make decisions, how their informal hierarchies actually form, and how they can be reshaped, how the social mechanisms that determine whose influence is structurally amplified and whose is structurally muted, and how a person who understands the formation process can position themselves within it in ways that the other members of the group will experience not as the exercise of influence, but as the natural emergence of someone who simply seems to understand the group better than anyone else, and whose judgment therefore naturally carries more weight. That naturalness is not an accident. It is an achievement constructed through the precise application of social knowledge that most people in most groups do not possess, and its invisibility is the primary source of its power. The formation of small group hierarchies and the specific mechanisms through which they can be influenced during the window of their formation before they solidify into the apparent natural order that most group members accept without examination is what the next section addresses, with the operational precision that the subject requires. Small group hierarchies form faster than most people believe possible and solidify more completely than most people recognize until they attempt to challenge them. The research on small group formation consistently finds that provisional status hierarchies are established within the first few interactions of a newly formed group, frequently within the first hour of the group's existence, and that these provisional hierarchies, if not actively disrupted during the brief window of their formation, tend to become self-reinforcing structures that persist with remarkable stability even when the original basis for the hierarchy has long since ceased to be relevant. The person who is most verbally confident in the first meeting retains a status advantage that their subsequent behavior must significantly contradict before the group will revise its assessment. The person who deferred visibly in the early interactions carries a status deficit that genuine competence demonstrated later will only partially correct, because the group's social processing system has already built a model of this person that filters subsequent information through its initial conclusions. This is the most consequential piece of structural knowledge available to anyone who wants to understand and influence small group dynamics. The formation window is brief, the hierarchies that form during it are sticky, and the person who understands this and positions themselves deliberately during the formation window operates with an advantage that lasts for the entire life of the group. Most people enter new groups without any awareness that a formation process is occurring, treating the early interactions as social pleasantries whose primary function is the establishment of basic familiarity, rather than as the critical period during which the group's entire subsequent power structure is being written. By the time most people recognize that a hierarchy has formed and that their position within it is not where they would prefer to be, the formation window has closed, and the cost of repositioning has increased by an order of magnitude. The mechanisms through which hierarchies form in small groups are not random and not primarily determined by the objective qualities of the group members, though objective qualities contribute to the process. They are determined primarily by the social signals that group members emit during the early interactions, signals that the group's collective social intelligence processes and converts into a provisional status map that then shapes how subsequent contributions from each member are received and weighted. The most consequential of these signals in the formation period are not the signals of competence or expertise, though these matter, but the signals of internal status, the degree to which each group member's behavior during early interactions conveys a self-assessment that is independent of the group's emerging assessment of them. A person who enters a new group and behaves in ways that communicate genuine comfort with their own presence, genuine indifference to the group's provisional assessment of their status, and genuine interest in the group's dynamics from an observational rather than an approval-seeking orientation, will be assigned higher status by the group's collective social processing than a person of equivalent or superior objective capability who enters the same group with behavior that communicates social monitoring, approval seeking, or the anxiety of someone who needs the group's positive assessment to feel settled. This is not a superficial observation about confidence as a social signal. It is a structural observation about how small groups allocate influence. They allocate it toward the members whose behavior communicates that they have already been validated by a standard higher than the group's own assessment, because that communication is the social signal that most reliably predicts the kind of consistent, pressure-resistant judgment that groups depend on from their de facto leaders. The deliberate positioning during the formation window therefore requires two simultaneous orientations that most people find psychologically difficult to maintain together. The first is genuine attentiveness to the group's dynamics, not the performance of attentiveness, but the actual investment of observational resources in understanding who the other members are, what they need, what they fear, what drives their behavior, and how the emerging hierarchy is organizing itself around those individual profiles. This genuine attentiveness is the foundation of the influence that will be exercised later, because influence in small groups is always anchored in accurate understanding of the specific individuals who compose the group, and the person who invests in that understanding during the formation period has an informational advantage over every other member that compounds across the life of the group. The second orientation is the maintenance of the internal stability signals described above, the behavioral communication of a person who is genuinely interested in the group but not dependent on the group's assessment for their own internal equilibrium. These two orientations together produce a specific behavioral profile during the formation period that groups consistently read as the profile of someone worth orienting toward, deeply attentive to the group, but not anxious about their place within it, genuinely engaged with the people present, but not performing for their approval, observationally precise about what is happening in the room, but not visibly strategic in the way that groups feel managed rather than led. The invisibility of the strategic orientation is as important as the strategy itself because small groups are extraordinarily sensitive to the detection of management, to the sense that someone is operating on them rather than with them, and the detection of that management produces exactly the defensive consolidation against the managing party that makes influence impossible. The specific tactics for positioning during the formation window, the precise behavioral choices that communicate the correct signals during the critical early interactions without producing the visibility of strategic intent that would trigger the group's defensive response, are what the remainder of this section addresses. The first and most consequential of these tactics is the management of your initial verbal contribution to the group. Not the content of what you say, which is secondary, but the timing, the frequency, and the quality of attention that precedes your first significant contribution. The person who contributes early and frequently in a new group is running the approval-seeking signal, regardless of how valuable their contributions are, because frequency of early contribution is itself a social signal, whose primary reading is the need for the group's attention and validation. The person who observes more than they contribute in the early interactions, whose contributions, when they arrive, are precisely timed and carry the weight of genuine prior observation, is running the dominance-silence signal, described in the previous book in this series, and its status effect in the formation period is as powerful in small groups as it is in the larger social contexts that book addressed. The bilateral relationships that form during a small group's early period are the actual infrastructure of influence within the group, more consequential than any group-level positioning and more durable than any collective impression that early group interactions produce. This is because small groups do not make decisions as unified collectives. They make decisions through a network of bilateral relationships whose aggregate state at any given moment determines what the group as a whole will accept, resist, or produce. The person who understands the group's decision-making process as a network phenomenon rather than a collective one, who maps the bilateral relationships and their relative weights rather than treating the group as a single entity to be addressed, has access to an influence architecture that operates far below the threshold of the group's collective awareness, and therefore far below the threshold of its collective resistance. The mapping of bilateral relationships within a small group requires the identification of three specific relational variables for each pair of group members: the direction of influence between them, meaning which party's positions tend to shift toward the others when they disagree; The emotional valence of the relationship, meaning whether it is organized primarily around mutual attraction, mutual tension, or instrumental utility, and the information flow between them, meaning who tells whom what, how quickly, and with what degree of selective filtering. These three variables, mapped across all bilateral relationships in the group, produce a picture of the group's actual decision-making architecture that is radically different from its official structure and from the status hierarchy that its public interactions suggest. The person who holds the most formal authority in the group is frequently not the person whose bilateral relationships give them the most actual influence over the group's decisions. The person whose bilateral relationships are most strategically positioned, who is in a positive influence direction with the most other members, whose information flow reaches the most nodes most quickly, and whose emotional valence with each member is calibrated to what that specific member most responds to, is the person whose preferences become the group's preferences most consistently and most invisibly. The construction of your own bilateral relationship network within a new group during the formation period follows a sequence that is determined by the relational topology of the group rather than by your personal preferences for which group members you find most interesting or most socially comfortable. The sequence begins with the identification of the group's informal connector, the member whose bilateral relationships with the other members are most numerous and most emotionally positive, who functions as the group's social hub, whose approval of a new member most efficiently distributes positive assessment of that member throughout the group's relational network. The informal connector is not always the most obviously social member. They are frequently a person whose social investment in the group is not the most visible, but whose relational reach is the broadest, whose bilateral relationships with each other member are characterized by a quality of genuine interest that makes each member feel individually valued rather than generically included. Establishing a strong bilateral relationship with the informal connector early in the formation period produces a status distribution effect that reaches every other member of the group through the connector's existing relationships, without requiring you to have yet established individual relationships with each of those members. It is the most efficient single investment of relational resources available during the formation period, and it is the investment that most people in most new groups do not make deliberately because they are not mapping the group's relational topology. Topology with sufficient precision to identify the connector as distinct from the most visible or most formally prominent member. The second bilateral relationship to prioritize during the formation period is with the group's primary skeptic, the member who is most resistant to social influence, whose positions are least likely to shift in response to group pressure, and whose resistance to influence is most visible to the other group members. The primary skeptic holds a paradoxical position in the group's influence architecture. They are typically not the most influential member in terms of whose preferences become the group's preferences, but they are the most consequential member in terms of whose resistance prevents a preference from becoming the group's preference. A proposal or position that the primary skeptic resists will rarely achieve group adoption, regardless of how many other members support it, because the skeptic's resistance signals to the other members that the proposal has not been sufficiently scrutinized and that adoption carries the social risk of having overlooked something that the group's most critical thinker found inadequate. Conversely, a proposal or position that the primary skeptic accepts or even fails to actively resist achieves a quality of apparent credibility that the support of more easily influenced members cannot provide. The approach to building a bilateral relationship with the primary skeptic requires a fundamental reorientation from the approach that works with most other group members. The primary skeptic is immune to the social warmth and genuine attentiveness that build bilateral relationships with connection-oriented group members, not because they do not value human connection, but because they have developed a high sensitivity to the detection of strategic warmth that is deployed as an influence instrument rather than expressed as genuine interest. The relationship with the primary skeptic is built through a different channel entirely, the channel of genuine intellectual engagement, the demonstration that your thinking is rigorous enough to withstand their scrutiny and honest enough to acknowledge the limits of its own certainty. The primary skeptic does not need to like you to become a bilateral relationship asset. They need to respect your thinking, and that respect is earned through a quality of engagement with their positions that most people in most groups are not willing to provide, because it requires the genuine acknowledgement of the skeptic's points, rather than the performance of consideration followed by the reassertion of your original position. The third priority in bilateral relationship construction during the formation period is the identification and cultivation of the group's swing members, the individuals whose influence direction is not yet determined, who have not yet formed strong bilateral allegiances with any of the group's emerging power nodes, and whose eventual alignment will significantly shape the group's overall influence topology. Swing members are the most accessible bilateral relationship investment during the formation period because their relational availability is highest, and the quality of early investment in those relationships tends to produce durable alignment precisely because it precedes the formation of competing allegiances that would make the investment more costly. The group's narrative about who you are is not formed from your self-presentation. It is formed from the intersection of your behavior, the group's existing interpretive frameworks, and the bilateral conversations that group members have about you when you are not present. This last element is the most consequential and the least addressed in conventional social influence frameworks, because most people's mental model of reputation management is focused on the impression they make directly on the people whose assessment they want to influence, treating the bilateral conversations that occur in their absence as either unknowable or uncontrollable. Both assumptions are incorrect. The bilateral conversations that group members have about you in your absence are not random. They follow predictable patterns determined by the relational topology of the group, and they are not uncontrollable. They are significantly shaped by the specific behaviors you exhibit in the presence of each pair of group members, because those behaviors provide the raw material from which the absent conversation is constructed. The management of your group narrative therefore operates through two distinct channels simultaneously. The first is the direct channel, the behaviors you exhibit in full group settings that provide the material from which the group's collective narrative is constructed. The second is the indirect channel, the behaviors you exhibit in bilateral interactions with each group member that provide the material from which that member's contribution to the absent conversation is constructed. The indirect channel is the more powerful of the two because it is less visible to the group as a whole and therefore less subject to the collective skepticism that groups apply to behaviors that appear to be performed for the group's benefit. A behavior exhibited in full group settings is evaluated partly as a social performance, as something that the exhibitor knew would be seen and therefore may have shaped for effect. A behavior exhibited in a bilateral interaction is evaluated as more authentically representative of the person's actual character because the bilateral context carries less obvious social performance pressure than the full group context. The specific behaviors that produce the most powerful positive narrative contributions in bilateral interactions are not the behaviors that most people prioritize in relationship building. They are not the behaviors of being entertaining, being warm, or being generous with time and attention, though these are not irrelevant. The behaviors that produce the most durable and most influential narrative contributions are the behaviors of being genuinely useful in ways that are specific to the individual receiving the usefulness, and of being reliably discreet with information that the other party shared in the bilateral context and would not want circulated in the full group context.
Specific usefulness creates the bilateral experience of someone who understands what you actually need and cares enough to address it, which produces a narrative contribution of someone who is both perceptive and genuinely oriented toward others' interests. Reliable discretion creates the bilateral experience of someone who can be trusted with information that carries social risk, which is the rarest and most valuable social quality in any group context, because the supply of genuinely discreet people in most social environments is extremely low, and the demand for them among people who have anything worth protecting is correspondingly high. The narrative management challenge becomes most acute when the group has already formed a narrative about you that does not serve your influence objectives, either because you entered the group without the strategic awareness this text provides and allowed the narrative to form from unmanaged behavior, or because deliberate misrepresentation by another group member has shaped the narrative in directions that your actual behavior contradicts. In both cases, the correction of an established negative narrative requires a specific sequence that most people reverse, producing interventions that are technically correct but strategically ordered in a way that makes them less effective than they would be in the correct sequence. Most people attempt to correct a narrative by first changing the behavior that generated it, demonstrating through direct behavioral evidence that the narrative is inaccurate. This approach fails more often than it succeeds because the behavioral change occurs in full group settings, where it is subject to the performance skepticism described above, and where the group's existing narrative provides a ready interpretation of the behavioral change as strategic rather than authentic. The correct sequence begins not with behavioral change in full group settings, but with narrative intervention in bilateral settings, specifically with the informal connector and the swing members identified in the previous section, whose narrative contributions carry the most weight in the group's collective assessment, and whose bilateral relationship with you is most accessible to the kind of genuine one-to-one engagement that produces authentic narrative revision. The narrative intervention in bilateral settings does not take the form of explicit reputation management, of telling the other person directly that the group's narrative about you is inaccurate and providing counter-evidence. Explicit reputation management in bilateral settings is detected immediately as such and produces the opposite of the intended effect, because it communicates that you are aware of and concerned about the negative narrative, which confirms rather than contradicts the social anxiety signals that most negative narratives are organized around. The narrative intervention takes the form of genuine bilateral interaction that naturally produces experiences inconsistent with the existing narrative, experiences that the other person then contributes to the absent conversation from a position of genuine first-hand evidence, rather than from a position of having been told what to think. The construction of those genuine bilateral experiences, calibrated to the specific narrative elements that most need revision and to the specific relational profiles of the bilateral partners whose narrative contributions carry most weight, requires the same precise individual understanding of group members that the formation period mapping was designed to produce. This is why the investment in genuine understanding of each group member during the formation period is not merely a relationship-building activity. It is the intelligence-gathering operation that makes every subsequent influence activity within the group more precisely targeted and therefore more effective than it could be without that foundational understanding. Information is the actual currency of small group decision-making, and the person who controls the information environment of a small group controls its decisions with a completeness and an invisibility that no other influence mechanism can match. This is not a metaphor. It is a precise description of the causal relationship between information and group decision-making that the research on small group dynamics consistently demonstrates. Groups make decisions based on the information available to them at the moment of decision, and the decisions they make are therefore determined as much by what information is present, what information is absent, and how the available information is framed, as by any objective assessment of the situation they are deciding about.
The person who shapes the information environment shapes the decision space, and shaping the decision space is the most fundamental form of influence available in any human system, as this text's companion volume on the architecture of Tower established in its foundational sections. The control of information in small groups operates through 4 distinct mechanisms, each of which addresses a different dimension of the group's information environment, and each of which can be developed and exercised independently, though their combined deployment produces an influence effect that is significantly greater than the sum of their individual contributions. The first mechanism is information gatekeeping, the positioning of yourself as the primary node through which significant information flows into the group from external sources. Every small group exists within a larger information environment, from which it receives inputs that shape its collective understanding of its situation, its options, and the constraints within which its decisions must be made. The member who most consistently brings significant external information into the group, who is most reliably the first to know things that the group needs to know, and most consistently the person through whom that knowledge enters the group's collective awareness, occupies a structural position of extraordinary influence, because every piece of information they introduce arrives pre-framed by the context in which they introduce it, and pre-validated by the group's dependence on them as an information source. The development of an information gatekeeping position requires 2 parallel investments. The first is the cultivation of external information sources that are genuinely superior to those available to other group members through the maintenance of relationships and information networks outside the group that provide access to relevant information before it reaches the group through other channels. The second is the development of a reputation within the group for information quality, the consistent demonstration that the information you introduce is accurate, relevant, and consequential, so that the group's processing of your information contributions is characterized by the kind of trust that makes your framing of that information the primary lens through which the group interprets it. An information gatekeeper whose information quality is inconsistent or whose accuracy is occasionally questionable loses the framing advantage that makes the gatekeeping position so powerful, because the group begins to apply independent verification to information introduced through a source whose reliability has been demonstrated to be imperfect. The second information control mechanism is narrative framing, the shaping of how the group interprets information that it receives through multiple channels simultaneously, including channels that you do not control. In any small group, the same piece of information can be interpreted in multiple ways, depending on the context in which it is processed, the prior beliefs and concerns that the group brings to its interpretation, and the framing that the first person to publicly interpret it provides to the group's collective processing. The person who consistently speaks first in the group's processing of new information, who provides the initial interpretive frame through which the other members then process the same information, has a disproportionate influence over the group's eventual collective interpretation, because the initial frame creates a cognitive anchor that subsequent interpretations must work against rather than from a neutral starting position. The deployment of narrative framing as an influence mechanism requires both the speed to introduce the interpretive frame before other members have publicly committed to their own interpretations, and the authority that makes your frame the one the group adopts rather than one of several competing interpretations that the group must adjudicate between. The authority dimension of framing is where the bilateral relationship investments of the formation period pay their most direct dividends, because the group members whose narrative contributions about you have produced a collective assessment of genuine insight and reliable judgment are the members who will adopt your interpretive frame most readily, and their adoption of it will influence the remaining members through the same bilateral conversation mechanisms that shape the group's narrative about its members.
The third information control mechanism is the strategic silence about specific information, the deliberate withholding of information that, if shared with the group, would constrain the group's decision space in directions that do not serve your influence objectives. This mechanism requires the most precise ethical calibration of any in the information control system, because the withholding of information that the group needs to make decisions in its own genuine interest is a form of manipulation that produces outcomes harmful to the group members, and that will, if detected, destroy the trust on which your entire influence architecture is built with a completeness and a speed that no subsequent investment in the group can repair. The strategic silence that serves legitimate influence objectives is the withholding of information that is not relevant to the group's genuine interests, but that, if introduced, would generate unproductive conflict, would activate defensive reactions that would make rational decision-making impossible, or would create premature closure around options that deserve more thorough consideration before the group commits to them. The fourth information control mechanism is the management of the group's memory, the shaping of how the group collectively recalls past decisions, past events, and past interactions in ways that make the current decision space more favorable to the outcomes you are working toward. Small groups have collective memories that are reconstructive rather than reproductive, subject to the same selective and interpretive processes that individual memory is subject to, and therefore susceptible to the same kinds of framing effects that shape the interpretation of new information. The person who most consistently provides the group with its reference points for past events, who most frequently reminds the group of relevant past decisions and their outcomes, who frames the group's history in ways that make current preferred directions appear consistent with established group values and past group successes, is exercising an influence over the group's decision-making that reaches backward through time as well as forward into the future.
Real group decision-making processes are never the rational, collective deliberations that most groups believe themselves to be engaged in when they are making decisions. They are social processes in which the outcome is determined by the interaction of the influence architecture described in the previous sections, the emotional states of the group members at the moment of decision, the social costs and benefits that different decision outcomes carry for the individuals within the group, and the specific sequencing of contributions that shapes the group's sense of which direction has momentum and which direction is losing ground. Understanding this reality, rather than the idealized model of collective deliberation that most groups maintain about their own decision-making, is the prerequisite for influencing real group decisions with the precision and the reliability that this text is concerned with developing. The emotional states of group members at the moment of decision are the most underweighted variable in most people's models of group decision-making, and the most consequential variable in the actual outcome of most group decisions. Groups that are in a state of collective anxiety make different decisions than groups in a state of collective confidence, not because anxiety and confidence provide different information about the decision at hand, but because they activate different cognitive processing modes that weight different types of considerations differently. Anxious groups overweight risks, underweight opportunities, prefer the familiar over the novel, and are more susceptible to the influence of the group member who most effectively communicates certainty, regardless of whether that certainty is justified by the available information. Confident groups overweight opportunities, underweight risks, are more receptive to novel proposals, and are more susceptible to the influence of the group member who most effectively communicates vision and possibility. The person who understands this dynamic and who can read the group's collective emotional state with sufficient accuracy to calibrate their influence approach to the specific processing mode the group is currently operating in has a decisive advantage over everyone else in the group who is deploying a fixed influence approach, regardless of the group's emotional context.
The management of the group's collective emotional state before and during decision-making moments is therefore not a peripheral concern of the small group influence system. It is a central lever of the system, and its deliberate management, the shaping of the group's emotional context in ways that make the decision space most favorable to the outcomes you are working toward, is among the most consequential influence activities available to the sophisticated group operator. This management does not require dramatic emotional interventions. It operates through the accumulated effect of small behavioral contributions that shift the group's emotional register incrementally in the desired direction. The introduction of information that generates collective confidence before a decision that requires risk tolerance, the acknowledgement of genuine concerns that reduces the anxiety spiral that makes groups retreat to overcautious decisions, the reframing of a threatening situation in terms that activate the group's sense of capability rather than its sense of vulnerability. The social costs and benefits that different decision outcomes carry for individual group members are the second most underweighted variable in conventional models of group decision-making, and the most reliable predictor of how individual members will position themselves when the group's collective deliberation reaches its decision point. Every group member is simultaneously a participant in the group's collective deliberation and an individual whose personal interests are served differently by different decision outcomes. And the tension between these two roles is resolved, in most people in most groups, by a process of motivated reasoning that produces positions that serve personal interests while being experienced and presented as positions that serve collective interests. The person who maps each group member's personal stake in different decision outcomes before the group deliberates has a precise picture of where each member's position will land when deliberation begins, what kinds of arguments will be most effective with each member, and where the genuine points of alignment and conflict within the group's decision-making process are located before they become visible in the deliberation itself. This pre-deliberation mapping is the most valuable intelligence product available to the small group influence operator because it allows the construction of a deliberation strategy that addresses each member's personal stake in a way that makes the preferred outcome appear to serve that stake, rather than a strategy that makes the preferred outcome appear to serve some abstract collective good that the member may or may not identify with at the moment of decision. The group member who feels that the preferred outcome serves their personal interests will support it with the full resources of their motivated reasoning, producing arguments, finding evidence, and applying social pressure on their behalf in ways that they experience as genuine advocacy for the group's best interests, rather than as the exercise of personal preference. Their support therefore carries a quality of apparent authenticity that directly purchased support would never achieve. The sequencing of contributions during the deliberation itself is the third critical variable in real group decision-making, and it is the variable over which the sophisticated group operator has the most direct control because it does not require the management of other people's behavior, but only the precise timing of their own. The sequencing of contributions matters because group deliberations are not neutral aggregations of independently formed positions. They are sequential social processes in which earlier contributions shape the interpretive frame for later ones, in which the apparent momentum of a position influences whether uncommitted members join it or resist it, and in which the timing of a pivotal contribution, one that either consolidates emerging consensus or introduces a reconsideration that redirects the deliberation, determines whether that contribution functions as a decisive influence or as one input among many that the group's momentum has already moved past. The sophisticated group operator speaks neither first nor last in most deliberations. Speaking first carries the framing advantage described in the information control section, but also the risk of premature commitment to a position before the deliberation has revealed where the group's genuine concerns and resistances are located. Speaking last carries the advantage of knowing where every other member has positioned themselves, but also the risk of entering a deliberation whose momentum has already consolidated around a direction that a late contribution cannot redirect without a social cost that exceeds the influence benefit. The optimal timing is the contribution that arrives at the moment when the deliberation has revealed the genuine landscape of positions and concerns, but has not yet consolidated around a direction, the moment when a precisely targeted contribution can shape the emerging consensus, rather than having to overcome an established one. The pivotal contribution that shapes emerging group consensus rather than having to overcome established momentum is distinguished from ordinary deliberative contributions by three specific characteristics that must be present simultaneously for the contribution to function at its full influence potential. The first characteristic is synthetic authority. The contribution must appear to emerge from a genuine synthesis of what has already been said, rather than from a predetermined position that the contributor brought into the deliberation independently of the group's actual discussion. This appearance of synthesis is what gives the pivotal contribution its quality of apparent collective wisdom, its capacity to land as the articulation of what the group was collectively moving toward, rather than as the imposition of an individual preference onto the group's deliberative process. The group members who support the pivotal contribution do so with the specific enthusiasm of people who feel that their own thinking has been understood and elevated rather than overridden, because the synthetic framing incorporates enough of each member's expressed concerns to produce that feeling of recognition, even when the conclusion being advanced was determined before the deliberation began. The construction of synthetic authority requires the genuine attention to the deliberation described in the previous section, the investment in actually hearing what each member is saying, rather than waiting for the moment to introduce a prepared contribution. The genuine attention is not merely strategic, though it is also strategic. It is the only way to produce a synthesis that is accurate enough to be recognized as genuine by the people whose contributions it is synthesizing, because a synthetic framing constructed from inaccurate or selective understanding of what was said will be detected as such by the members whose positions were misrepresented, and that detection will undermine the pivotal contribution's authority at exactly the moment when that authority is most needed. The second characteristic of the pivotal contribution is positional generosity, the explicit attribution of the core insight of the preferred direction to other group members whose support for that direction is most valuable. This attribution does not require that the insight actually originated with those members, only that it can be honestly connected to something they said or implied during the deliberation. The effect of this attribution on the attributed members is immediate and powerful. They experience the validation of having their contribution recognized as central to the group's emerging direction, which produces a motivation to support that direction with the full resources of their social influence within the group. The pivotal contribution has not merely advanced a preferred direction, it has recruited the group's most valuable supporters to that direction by giving them a personal stake in its success that they did not have before the attribution occurred. The third characteristic is decisional closure. The pivotal contribution must provide the group with a sense of sufficient resolution to move from deliberation to decision, without forcing a closure that the group experiences as premature and therefore resists. This is the most delicate calibration in the construction of the pivotal contribution, because the threshold between sufficient resolution and premature closure varies across groups and across decision contexts in ways that cannot be precisely predicted from outside the deliberation itself. It can only be read from inside the deliberation, from the accumulated signals of the group's emotional state, the apparent exhaustion of the primary lines of argument, and the micro-signals of readiness that group members emit when their internal processing has reached a tentative conclusion that they are waiting for social permission to commit to. The sophisticated group operator reads these signals and times the pivotal contribution to provide exactly that social permission, the sense that the group has now heard what it needed to hear and that moving to decision is the natural next step rather than an imposition. The group dynamics that most reliably derail well-constructed influence strategies fall into three categories, each of which requires a specific adaptive response that the sophisticated group operator prepares for before the deliberation begins, rather than improvising in response to as the deliberation unfolds. The first is the emergence of a counter-coalition, two or more group members whose bilateral relationship each other's strong enough that their joint resistance to a preferred direction produces a social weight that individual resistance from either party alone would not generate. Counter-coalitions are most effectively addressed not during the deliberation in which they emerge, but before that deliberation occurs, through bilateral relationship management that either incorporates the potential counter-coalition members into the preferred direction before the group deliberation begins, or identifies the specific concern that is likely to drive their joint resistance and addresses it through bilateral engagement that makes the joint resistance less necessary. The second derailing dynamic is deliberative hijacking, the redirection of the group's deliberative attention toward a secondary issue that is genuinely relevant, but that, if fully deliberated, will consume the group's decision-making energy before the primary issue has been resolved in a direction that serves the sophisticated operator's influence objectives. Deliberative hijacking is most commonly executed unintentionally by group members whose personal concerns about the secondary issue are genuine, but it can be deployed deliberately by a group member who recognizes that exhausting the group's deliberative resources on a secondary issue is the most effective available strategy for preventing a decision on the primary issue. The response to deliberative hijacking, whether intentional or not, is the explicit and socially gentle return of the group's attention to the primary issue through a reframing that acknowledges the importance of the secondary issue while establishing a clear sequencing that places the primary issue first. The third derailing dynamic is authority challenge, a direct challenge to the sophisticated operator's influence position within the group, typically delivered by the group member who has most accurately read the operator's influence architecture and who has decided that challenging it serves their own interests within the group's power structure. The authority challenge is the most serious of the three derailing dynamics because it operates at the level of the operator's structural position within the group rather than at the level of a specific decision, and an ineffective response to it can damage the entire influence architecture rather than merely the outcome of a single deliberation. The response to an authority challenge must be calibrated with exceptional precision, maintaining the internal stability signals that the operator's influence position is built on, while engaging with the substance of the challenge in a way that demonstrates the genuine rigor that makes the operator's influence position legitimate, rather than merely positional. The expansion of influence beyond the primary group begins with the accurate understanding of how small groups are embedded within larger social networks. How the influence capital accumulated within a primary group can be converted into influence currency that operates in those larger networks. Every small group exists within a social ecology that includes other small groups, larger institutional structures, and the informal networks that connect individuals across group boundaries. The person who has developed a strong influence position within their primary group has accumulated three specific resources that are directly convertible into influence in the broader social ecology: a demonstrated track record of effective judgment that extends beyond the group's boundaries as reputation, a network of bilateral relationships whose members each have their own group memberships and network connections, and a practical understanding of small group dynamics that transfers across group contexts because its foundations are in the universal mechanisms of human social processing rather than in the specific characteristics of any single group.
The conversion of these resources into broader influence operates through a mechanism that the research on social network dynamics describes as bridging, the occupation of positions that connect otherwise disconnected groups or network nodes, providing a flow of information, resources, and social capital across boundaries that would otherwise limit the movement of all three. The bridge position is among the most structurally powerful positions available in any social network because the person who occupies it controls the flow between the networks they connect, and control of flow is control of the information asymmetries, the resource access differentials, and the relationship formation opportunities that determine the distribution of influence across the broader social ecology. The sophisticated group operator who has developed strong bilateral relationships within their primary group and who has developed genuine understanding of the group members' needs, capabilities, and external connections is positioned to identify the bridge opportunities that their primary group's external connections make available and to move into those bridge positions before other members of the group recognize their value. The development of bridge positions requires a specific expansion of the observational discipline that the sophisticated group operator has applied within their primary group to the broader social ecology within which that group is embedded. The same questions that produced the relational topology map of the primary group must now be applied at a larger scale. Where are the disconnections between groups that, if bridged, would create significant value for the members of both groups? Where are the information asymmetries between groups that, if reduced, would produce outcomes that the sophisticated operator can shape in favorable directions? Where are the relationship formation opportunities that the sophisticated operator's position across group boundaries makes available? Which of those relationships would most expand the reach and structural depth of their influence network? The ethics of bridge position occupation are more complex than the ethics of influence within a single group, because the bridge position creates simultaneous obligations to multiple groups whose interests are not always aligned, and the management of those obligations requires a degree of transparency about the operator's cross-group connections that single-group influence does not require. A group member who discovers that someone they trusted with group-specific information has been using that information to advance their position in a different group will experience that discovery as a betrayal, regardless of whether the use of the information caused them direct harm, because it reveals that the bilateral trust they extended was being treated as a resource rather than as a relationship. The sophisticated operator who occupies bridge positions manages this tension by maintaining clear distinctions between what information flows across group boundaries and what information is held within the group context where it was generated, and by being sufficiently transparent about their cross-group connections that group members are not surprised to learn of them when they inevitably do. The expansion of influence through the social network beyond the immediate bridge positions available through the primary group's external connections follows the same principles that governed the development of influence within the primary group, applied at a larger scale and with a longer time horizon. The bilateral relationship investments that produced the influence architecture within the primary group must be replicated within each new group context that the sophisticated operator enters, adapted to the specific relational topology and decision-making dynamics of each new group, but built on the same foundational understanding of how small groups form hierarchies, how bilateral relationships determine collective decisions, and how information control shapes the decision space within which group choices are made. The accumulation of these influence positions across multiple groups, each reinforced by the bridge connections that link them, produces a social network architecture of extraordinary reach and resilience because it is distributed across multiple groups rather than concentrated in a single one, and therefore survives the disruptions, conflicts, and restructurings that affect any specific group without collapsing the entire influence architecture. The maintenance of this expanded influence network requires a resource management discipline that single group influence does not require, because the bilateral relationship investments that anchor influence in each group context must be sustained across all of them simultaneously, and the cognitive and emotional resources required for genuine bilateral relationship maintenance are finite. The sophisticated operator who has expanded across multiple group contexts must therefore make explicit prioritization decisions about which relationships within which groups receive the deepest investment at any given time, cycling that investment in response to the strategic importance of each group context at each stage of their broader influence objectives, rather than attempting to maintain equal investment across all contexts simultaneously, which produces relationships that are insufficiently deep in any context to anchor genuine influence. The complete operational identity of the sophisticated small group operator is not the identity of someone who manipulates the people around them. It is the identity of someone who understands the people around them with a depth and a precision that most people never develop, and who uses that understanding to create conditions in which genuinely good outcomes become more likely than they would be without their involvement. This reframing is not a rationalization. It is an accurate description of what sophisticated, small group influence, practiced with genuine ethical grounding, actually produces in the groups it is applied to. Groups that have a sophisticated operator within them make better decisions than groups that do not because the sophisticated operator's preferences are always superior to what the group would have chosen without their influence, but because the sophisticated operator's understanding of each member's actual needs and concerns, their management of the emotional context of group decision-making, and their construction of decision processes that surface the group's genuine collective intelligence rather than its social defaults, produces decisions that more accurately reflect what the group actually values and more effectively serve what the group actually needs. The person who reads this text and takes from it only the tactical dimension, these specific techniques for positioning during formation periods, for building bilateral relationship networks, for controlling information environments and timing pivotal contributions, will produce influence within their groups, but not the kind that this text ultimately describes. The tactics without the foundational understanding of why they work, without the genuine investment in the individuals whose group membership you share, and without the ethical architecture that determines which influence objectives are worth pursuing and which are not, produce a sophisticated manipulator rather than a sophisticated operator. And the distinction between those two things is not merely moral, it is practical. The sophisticated manipulator produces short-term influence and long-term resistance because the people around them eventually detect, at the level of the social intelligence that this text has described throughout, that they are being managed rather than led, and that detection produces exactly the defensive consolidation that makes genuine influence impossible.